I'm John Buchanan. Quantize. She is a seductive temptress, isn't she? I think it's fair to say that no matter what kind of music you make, the knowledge that we can take a performance and we can make its timing absolutely perfect is something that is a sort of safety net we become increasingly reliant on if we're not careful. And the other thing to say before we actually start listening to it and making some music is also to recognise that Logic, like all workstations, really likes it if you want to work within a grid. I mean, for goodness sake, look at the grid lines. There they are to just basically divide our projects up into bars and beats and subbeats and breathe. Now, I've just set up a key command to turn those off. So effectively the grid lines are gone, but that doesn't change the fact that if I just draw a note in Logic, it's going to automatically snap to a particular value. And what we're going to do within this video is we're going to learn that the moment we are brave enough to either not quantize our music or to find ways to unpick grooves that are really rigid, suddenly there is life and breath and a human quality to the music that we make, which is often a lot better than something that's absolutely fixed. And yes, I'm even talking to you, techno dudes. We're starting with this sound, however. So here is a dreamy little collection of sounds from the Cinematic Funk Drum Machine Designer Kit, and those notes are completely on the grid. And if the video ended here, I'd have disproved my point. But the good news for all of you is we haven't even started. Okay, what I've got on my next track is a kit that I've used a lot before, which is called Birdland Calls, which I really like, and it contains kind of drums like this. Now, some of us like playing drums from keyboards, even little mini keyboards, and other people absolutely hate it, or it's something they haven't done before, or the idea of working out what they want their pattern to be is not something that's familiar, and that's fine. No problem with that. That's where we're going to start. I'm not about to perform this little drum groove. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to program it. Now, to prove the point about the fact that even though I've taken the grid lines out, effectively Logic is still very much thinking in a grid space, if I grab the pencil tool and click anywhere in this bar, let's say on the, I don't know, the 3rd 16th note of beat 2, it's still going to provide me with a block that starts absolutely rigidly at the beginning of the bar and lasts for a precise bar. Precision is key. Except that we're going to try and get away from that a little bit. So I'm going to double click here, and what we're going to do is we're going to program our beat loop. Now, if, as I've said, this is something that's unfamiliar to you, no problem. I'm just going to close down MIDI automation for a second so we can see these notes a little bit more clearly, and we'll make them a little bit bigger. And then what we have a chance to do is to see where we want our notes to go. And again, I can click anywhere in this first little grid line, and my note is going to arrive on the downbeat. Now at the moment MIDI out is off, which means we can't hear these notes as I put them in, but if I turn it on, we will hear it. And I think that the sort of pattern I was programming was a bit like bum, 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 crack, a bit like that. So what we've now got is a little kick and snare pattern that's going to last for a bar. Let's just solo it, and it's going to be absolutely on the grid lines. So I'm going to actually get rid of that one for a moment, and we're going to just have a groove that does that instead. Let's put a loop around just this bar. Now, for a pattern that's sort of trying to be a little bit wonky and a little bit funky, it's not doing a very good job. And there are two reasons for that. Firstly, every single note is the same velocity. And secondly, they are all absolutely on the grid, and that's a bit boring. So let's look at a couple of things that we could do. Firstly, what I'm going to do is to give this whole pattern a bit more shape by introducing a little bit of velocity programming. So I'm going to stress the downbeats. Now I am going to turn off MIDI out so that I can talk to you at the same time as doing this. I want a slightly stronger kick on the downbeats, and then what we're going to do is to have something which feels a bit more like that. The snare, which is here, feels a little bit kind of skinny from a volume perspective as well. So I'm going to just slightly increase that. And then what we'll do is to have, I don't know, something a bit more like that. Yeah, It's a bit more interesting. Maybe I've made that a little bit light. Okay, so we've got a tiny bit of volume variation, but still everything is on the grid. And that's going to get even worse if what I decide to do, as we frequently do, is to use one note to create another. So if I decided I wanted to add hats to this pattern, for instance, and I wanted them to play eighth notes, what often happens is we create one of these and say that's probably going to be a little bit loud, so I'll make it a bit quieter. And then what I'll do is I want this pattern to sort of play in eighth notes, so maybe I'll make that a little bit quieter too. And then what I'll do is I'll simply just duplicate these so that they can play wherever I want them to. And very quickly what I've done is to make a little bar of hi-hats to go with my kick and my snare right on the grid. Boring, isn't it? Now, of course, one thing I could do to add a little bit of groove would be to come up here to the Quantize options and to select something with a little bit of swing. Let's suppose I go for 1/16B swing. That's not going to change any of the hi-hats because they're all on eighth notes, but what it is going to do is to just introduce a little bit of groove to the kick drums that are allocated to 16th notes. And immediately what this does is to get these notes off the grid because suddenly they're doing something a little bit more interesting. And that is more interesting, but again, it's still relatively predictable. And those eighth notes are absolutely killing me because they're just so prescribed. Okay, now what I'm actually going to do is to make this problem worse before I make it better. And there is a reason for that. I'm going to duplicate this so that it plays 4 times in a row. Ooh, I'm in the wrong tool. Let's come back to the pencil tool and then mayhem will cease. Mayhem will cease. Sort of feels like it should be part of the kind of Olympus Has Fallen movie series. Okay, sounds like this. We don't need to listen to bars 7 and 8 because they're the same as 5 and 6. So when I talk about making the problem worse, what I mean is I've taken a 1 bar totally predictable pattern and what I've done is to make it 4 bars long, and that just compounds this sense that there is no variation. Now, of course, the temptation might be to try in some way to unquantize the rigidness of these notes, but I can't because I drew them in. So if I come back to the quantize value and I come to 0, no quantize, off, everything actually just snaps back onto the grid. Makes the problem even worse. There is no foundation for these notes that is anything other than perfectly in time, and from a velocity perspective, exactly the way that I created that first bar. So how might I introduce something that is just a little bit more human and a little bit less rigid if I don't go back and just simply play these notes in the first place? Well, the way that I can do that is I can select all of these notes, and then what I can do is to come to functions and I can come to MIDI transform. And what I have a chance to do here is to do a whole bunch of different things. Now, you might, as I hover here, be very seduced by this word de-Quantize, but actually we're going to see in a little while that's not going to help us. What that does is to allow me to select any notes that I've played in live and undo any quantize that I've applied to restore them to their original positions. But I didn't play them, so as a result, I can't de-Quantize them. But within MIDI Transform, what I can do is to come to Humanize. And what this is going to do is it's going to let me move these notes or apply some processing to these notes that is going to move them in a number of different ways. So the first thing that I can do is I can move them by position. In other words, I can randomly ask these notes to be reapportioned by up to this number of frames. Now, frames are subdivisions of a 16th note. So this little bar of numbers here relates to bars, this number on the left-hand side, beats, 16th notes, and then frames. In other words, if I entered a value of 1 at the start, a note could move up to a bar late or early, a whole bar. That's too much. I don't really want things to move by a beat either, or even a 16th note. But what I do want them to do is to move off the grid by up to a certain number of frames, up to 15. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that every note is going to move 15 frames early or late. It means up to that value. Some will go 7 or 6 or 5 or 2. Shall I name all of the numbers between 0 and 15? I'll save your time. I don't think I will, but that's what that means. The velocity, the same. I can randomize that. that in up to 10 steps, up or down. Some notes will get stronger and some will get quieter. And also I can, if I want to, randomize length. Now, of course, that's going to make much more sense for an instrument that isn't drums made up of one-shot samples. So in this context, that's not going to make any difference whatsoever, but I'll leave it as it is right now. So all I've done is to adjust the amount of position randomization. And if we look very carefully at the screen behind, when I press select and operate, all of the notes have moved. All of them. By how much? That's right, up to 15 240ths of a 16th note, because that's how many frames there are per 16th note. So when I come back and I close this window and I zoom in, what I'm going to discover is that the notes are no longer completely on the grid. And not only that, the kick and the hats don't arrive at exactly the same moment. Now, if I really zoom in, that's going to look amazingly dramatic, because suddenly these notes are all off the grid and we all start to get the kind of sweats on and we want to reach for Quantize all over again. But don't panic, it's okay. Let's have a listen. Still sounds pretty groovy. Well, a bit more groovy than it did before, but what I was going to say is it still sounds pretty quantized. 15, it turns out, isn't really very much. So should we do it again? So by doing it again, if I select all again and come back into MIDI transform, remember what I'm doing is to kind of compound the thing that I did before. By coming back in and randomizing again, actually some of those notes which were more out of time are going to move closer back to their grid lines, whereas others are going to go the other way. That's the great thing about random. Let's do it one more time. So now what we've got is randomization or humanization of randomness. Now, as I've probably said on this channel before, it's not lost on me that a processor called Humanize is coming from within a computer program. Should we just move on fast? But isn't that a nice moment where that snare is a little bit late? Good. Okay, and what I'm also going to do is to grab all of the hats by clicking on their note, and I'm going to turn their velocity down because they feel a little bit hot to me relative to the kicks and the snares. So now we've got a little bit of variation, and we've used a processor, Humanize, to provide that variation for us. And with the original sounds, the original samples, that sounds like this. And I'm just giving it a little tickle of compression as well. Okay, next, bass. Now then, here's another way that we could get off the grid. We could practice. So imagine what we'd set ourselves the challenge of doing would be to play in a bass line, which we are not going to quantize. We're just not going to do it, which means that if I don't get it right, I'm going to delete it and play it again. Now again, that might sound like the most obvious thing ever. If I was picking up my violin or I had microphones in front of a piano and we were recording this as an audio file, that'd be the only option I had if I wanted to kind of get my performance as close as possible to the timing that I was looking for. And yes, I could chop it up and I could get things on the grid, I suppose, if I really wanted to, but that's not really where the magic of music making happens. So to not distract myself by all of these amazing beats that I've made already, I'm going to solo the bass track, and what I'm going to do is to actually rehearse the part that I want to play. Now, I've got a bass line in mind, and I'm using the studio bass instrument. This is the American upright bass, which actually contains a number of different playing techniques within the keys. So in other words, I can hit everything hard, and we get the same articulation on every single note. But if I'm a little bit more considered in terms of the way that I play, at lower velocities, if I hold notes down, we get some really interesting little portamento moments, which is nice. And what I kind of want to do is to have this little portamento slide, but then to articulate the note at the top of this little pattern that I've got in mind. The pattern I've got in mind, by the way, goes like this. But I want this kind of slide on the way up. I can't do that without making a kind of slidey face. I'm sorry about that. But what I'm going to try and do is to play this pattern in with those little slides. And if I don't get it right, I'm going to delete it. I'm going to do it again. Should we have a listen with the click on? Okay, it's all right. The second one's not great. So what I'm going to do, as I said I would, is I'm going to chop this out this second time round. And I think to avoid, no, it's okay. I think it's going to be okay. I'm going to just drop in for this second time round. Let's try this second one a second time. Okay, I sort of hit that a little bit harder than I meant to. But it might be good with the beats. You never know. Let's turn the click off. And isn't that interesting? So straight away, by coming out of solo mode, the thing that drew my attention isn't bothering me anymore. I quite like the fact that we've got this kind of arrival on that second beat. Also, I think the timing's kind of okay. Should we quantize it? No. Well, we're not going to quantize it, but what I am going to do for a moment is to quantize it. And the reason for that is that I want to show you something. So if I open up this, this pattern of notes, we can see what's happening. We can see where these notes fall. We can see this little sort of arching 16th note phrase, including our little slides and our little bends. Now, of course, what happens, I'll keep the resolution quite high so we can see this happen. Let's just focus on these notes, taking note of the fact that, for example, this one is really quite early, but that's okay. I'm happy with that. But if I were to quantize this, I could select all of these notes here. I could choose the quantized value that I wanted here. Let's keep it the same as the drums. Let's go with 16B swing. And of course, what's going to happen the moment I select that is that all of these notes are going to snap to the grid, and it sounds like this. Okay, and that's less interesting, and we're going to turn that off in a moment so that I'm back to where I started. But I mentioned before the idea of de-Quantize. And of course, that exists up here in the functions menu. Now, if I come to de-Quantize, everything will go back to the place where I played it, and that's fine. I've got no problem with that. In fact, that is what we're going to do in just a moment. I'm going to take off this quantize value. But if I want to, I can be selective about that. So let's suppose I decided that I did want the Bs at the top of my sequence to remain absolutely in time. I want them to be where the quantized value has placed them. What I can actually do with de-Quantize is to be selective. I can select everything that isn't the top note, like that, and then what I could do would be to come to functions and de-Quantize, and all of the notes are going to move back to where they were, apart from the Bs. So if you've got an anchor note, if you've got a kind of downbeat that you really want to have be in time, you can do that. And actually, just to show you what I mean by that, probably a more sensible thing would be to say, let's just take the lowest note, which is the downbeat of each bar, and what we'll do is we'll de-Quantize that, and what that's going to do is to basically make sure that sorry, I've done that the wrong way around. Let's leave those where they are. Let's select everything else and let's de-Quantize those so that the pattern is loose apart from the downbeat, which is now going to be in time. So if I really wanted that bass note at the bottom to be absolutely locked with the kick drum, then fine. But you know what? Like I said, I'm feeling brave. I'm going to come back to these two. I'm also going to de-Quantize those notes and they'll go back to where they started. So now we've got a bass line completely unquantized. I know, it's like swimming in the bravest water imaginable. I thought there'd be sharks here, but it turns out actually it's quite nice, isn't it? Now then, what I've also got here is a little crazy collection of percussion sounds from Ultrabeat. This is a percussion bank. And I think there are some nice little noises here, which I also want to use within the project. I think they really are quite silly, some of these. So these three little sounds here, anyway, sorry, that's a joke that will only make sense to you if you ever grew up playing sort of school keyboards with built-in beats. If not, go to the next chapter, which is now. So what we're going to do here is we're going to put these little percussion sounds in sort of as a kind of accompaniment for the snare drum. In other words, I want something which is going to just make beat 2 a little bit more interesting. But we're going to do this in yet another way. I'm going to record them all together on beat 2 of each bar. And then what we're going to do, and probably beat 4 as well, or maybe not, we'll see. And then we're going to find a way to unpick those. Okay, so what I've done, what I've tried to do, is to make all of these land at exactly the same moment. Now, again, I'm not quantizing them, so they're going to be sort of out of time. I have a tendency to play a little bit early, and that's fine. I'm okay with that. I've made my peace with it. Can you tell? Can you tell? Yes. Okay, so what we've got is the different sort of velocities that are happening here on beat 2. But the notes kind of fall all at the same moment. And that's not really what I want. What I want is this kind of splang. Will and I are trying really hard not to call this episode splang, but I've said it now, so we're going to go with it. In other words, what I want is this kind of little smeary thing where, rather than all of these happening together, they slightly anticipate beat 2. In other words, what I'm going to do is to manually move these to separate them, but also to use beat 2 as a kind of anchor point without being absolutely prescriptive about where everything arrives. I can remind myself what all of them sound like. This is the first noise. Okay. That one's a little click. And this is our bossa nova moment. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this one arrive early by literally clicking, by holding down Control and dragging it left. This one's also going to arrive a little bit early, and then bossa nova can be late. What I'm going to do with the second one is to change the order at which they arrive. So this time, you're a bit loud actually. I'm going to turn you down. You're going to have too much bossa nova, turns out. Who knew? I'm going to have you arrive first, and that one's going to be last. So what I'm doing, be careful. What I'm going to do, oh look, I've got 2 selected now. Ah, I'm getting flustered. What we're going to do is to just basically make the variations of these all slightly different each time. That one's going to be even earlier that time. And then what we'll do is to make the last one the most kind of dramatic from a timing perspective. And again, you're too loud. Okay, what does that sound like? Okay, I really like that. The only one that's bothering me is the fact that all 3 of these arrive before the beat, and this feels like quite a lazy groove to me. And the idea that anything is arriving that early isn't brilliant. So what I'm going to do is to select all 3 of these, and I'm going to push them back. Now I could manually adjust them in the same way that I have before. I can hold down Control. Hold down Control and move them back. I can absolutely do that. But I'm going to put them back where they were for a moment, and instead I'm going to hold down Option and I'm going to arrow to the right. And what this is doing is it's nudging these notes. So effectively, every time I do this, I'm nudging, that's a technical term, which And the value for that is selectable here. So up at the top, I can see that the nudge value is currently selected as 10 ticks. And that's something I can change. So if I want to move in individual ticks, I can do exactly what I'm doing in 10 tick chunks, except that I'll have to press those buttons 10 times to get the same amount of nudge. In other words, I've got a chance to decide the value by which I want to nudge things. And if I want to, I can, again, nudge in beats or entire bars. If I wanted all of this to move into bar 6, then I can do that by simply selecting bar and then using that key command. But 10 ticks feels about right because it allows me to move things around until they feel like they're in a slightly happier place. Now, the only thing to say, just to finish up, is that on the repeat, when it comes back round, we're losing a note or two. And the reason for that, by taking things off grid, and particularly if you randomize, of course, the potential is there for notes to move early. And in the context of a 4-bar loop, if a note plays early, it's going to be in bar 4. It might look like it's in bar 5, but actually it's moved a few frames left, and as a result of that, it's in bar 4. And I think that's happening either in the Birdland Calls kit. Sure enough, this hi-hat is early, and therefore you can see it's happening in bar 4. And what that means is that when we get to the end of the cycle and it comes back round to the beginning, we're losing that hi-hat because the loop starts in bar 5 and the note is in bar 4. Have a listen. So we get the kick and not the hat. So if it turns out that that's not working for you, you don't like it, then of course you can just select that note and you could quantize it and put it on the grid. And if the quantized value isn't selected, it won't move, Jono. So let's select a 16th note instead. And now that note's going to be on that beat line. And I could do the same thing with the bass if I need to, but actually it turns out that I have played that note late and therefore it's in bar 5. So within this video, we've looked at a number of ways of getting off the grid. Now, the original sounds we worked to are absolutely quantized and on the grid. And of course, it helps to have something playing metronomically so that everything else can feed off that. So what we did to start with was to program these beats using the pencil tool, which means they're all exactly the same velocity and they're all absolutely on the grid line. And we used Humanize twice to unpick that. With the bass line, I've been brave and pretended that I'm a musician. And I haven't used Quantize, and what I've actually done is to overdub a second pass because it didn't feel as good as the first one, and practicing and feeling like I'm in my own rhythmical response feels like quite a nice way to add to this groove. And then obviously what we've done here is to try and play something absolutely in time and then manually move notes until they are sitting in a slightly different place on the grid. All different ways of bringing the splang. There we are, I've said it again.